Ann Arbor's talk station, 1290 WLBY. Welcome into Damian on Design on the Lucy Ann Lance Show. Each week we take a look at the impact design has in our lives. And one of the most impactful persons in design and architecture in our community passed away in September of 2014. He was 93 years old. And we are talking about David W. Osler. His son Peter Osler with us today. Our condolences to you and your family. What a remarkable man.
Thank you. Thank you.
A life of design.
Damian, when is the first time, Damian Farrell, that you encountered David Osler?
I had the pleasure of touring the office, which was an iconic little office. It was just gorgeous. Back in 1983. I came here as a student living with Carl and Janet Johnson, and Carl took me down one day to meet David and to see his office.
And this was the Washtenaw Light and Power substation on Fuller Road.
Yes.
With that perfect little courtyard. And I got to see these amazing pencil drawings that David did, these elevations of his buildings, which were just this light and dark, is really what characterized these drawings. And at that time he'd actually published what sort of, I don't know if you remember them, Peter, but they looked like almost a bookmarker size renderings. And I still have those. I've kept them.
Peter, at what age did you realize what your father did and his remarkable talent?
Well, perhaps in the womb, I guess. I don't know. It's, as I was...
You know, that's probably not too far off, since you and your siblings all went into design as well. You are an architect.
Yeah, we were brainwashed. Perhaps not intentionally, but it was just hard to avoid. We were... architecture wasn't a job for my father. It was really a way of life, as I think it is for a lot of architects. Yeah. It's a profession which really is... kind of immerses you in a way of thinking about the world, and that gets reflected in the things that you want to surround yourself with furniture and books and the space that you live in. So that was definitely our upbringing. We really were, I probably, grew up in a crib that was designed by Charles Eames. I don't think they exist, but if there was an Eames, we would have been in it. So yeah, it was definitely an immersion kind of life, an immersed life in design. All our vacations were, or many of the vacations were to go look at buildings and landscapes.
Really?
Yeah.
But your father did very different work than others that were out there.
Yeah, I think he. I'm not sure exactly what motivated him to do the kind of work that he did. He loved the work of Northern European architects. They were of great influence to him, and I think he certainly saw an opportunity and he had a real love for the modern lifestyle and the mid-century modern aesthetic, and his work, I would say, wasn't. There were people who were doing more aggressive work.
Right.
His work, I think, was very comfortable and found a nice position relative to the kind of clients that he had in Ann Arbor and in southeastern Michigan. He did buildings other places as well, but primarily in southeastern Michigan. I think that kind of Midwestern sensibility where you try to push things, but maybe not as far as they get pushed. I mean, he talked about this a lot, what his career would have been perhaps if he had gone to the coast.
One of the coasts with one of the larger firms.
Which I think, of course, he had the talent to do. But I think he liked serving people here. He was born and raised here, so a lot of his early clients were friends that he had gone to school with, high school friends.
A wonderful quote here. It came to me that all the ones that I liked, and he's talking about his buildings, obviously, that all the ones that I liked were times when everybody was copacetic. When I felt like the client was with me and I had a good feel for their personality. I always try to design houses with the client's personality in mind. And he really did, and there was this wonderful cleanliness to his architecture, beautiful simplicity. Everything had perfect proportion, at least in my mind. There was just never, he got that idea of paring things away to the essence and then leaving it there. And I think that's an extraordinary talent, the ability, we can all embellish, right? We can tell stories, we can also tell stories in architecture, we can throw trim at things and cover things up and layer it up, but to extract, I think, is the challenge.
And it was described in an Ann Arbor news article as his work being minimalist yet dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's, of course, when you're on the academic side, you see minimalists really pushed to an extreme level. And again, his work wasn't to that, he wasn't pushing things that far. I think there was a warmth to his work. There was, you know, by virtue of the materials that he chose and the way he would site houses, that was a huge part of his other buildings.
Picking up on the landscape?
Yeah, that was a huge part of it. And I think that came, I think this attitude that Damian spoke of and the work that you see of my father's really, in many ways, grew out of his upbringing in a very, you know, humble family on a farm with very earnest, soft-spoken parents who were really, you know, real hard workers. And he had grown up in the Depression, which really made an impression on him. And so I think he wasn't one to do opulent things. He, I think, always felt uncomfortable. You know, he did have some clients every once in a while who would want something, you know, kind of beyond what he was used to. And I think that on the one hand he kind of relished that to a certain level, but I think he always felt a bit uncomfortable about that because opulence was really not something he was comfortable with.
Yet his work and others like him have become the opulence of our times now. Isn't that interesting? How so many young people now are gravitating to these kinds of structures.
Yeah, although I mean, I think I don't know if I'd call it opulence. I mean, I think it's certainly valued, and it's of course played up in the press, and it's a prestigious thing. But you know, a lot of these houses are fairly small,
Yes,
and they have carports, you know, and things that you know, that don't, you know, they don't have 4-car garages and things like that. So I think a lot of the modern work in town is pretty understated, and I think maybe that's a nice sensibility to look toward.
We're talking with Peter Osler, who is the son, one of 3 children of David Osler, the architect from Ann Arbor. Talk about how passageways were really important and how when entry to the homes that your father created, it wasn't the traditional, here's your front door and you can see your neighbors and everyone could see into you. It was a journey. It was a journey to get into the homes of that Mr. Osler created.
Yeah, I think you know, my father wasn't a huge fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, he really appreciated his work, and it's interesting that my great uncle worked with Wright at Sullivan's office, George Elmsley, and so there was some history there where Elmsley was this understated, really thoughtful man, and of course Wright was anything but understated, and I think they had real conflict of personalities, and that kind of also was something we inherited kind of growing up, but it's kind of interesting about how to view Wright. But one thing that I think that he did really appreciate in Wright was the way that Wright sited his houses, and also the way that he did, in fact, create these really beautiful, circuitous might be too strong a word, but these journeys where one has multiple turns coming into the house, and that the house is oftentimes in the front. In my father's work, at least at a certain point, they were fairly quiet, and like you say, they were sometimes blank in many ways. The idea was that the journey kind of happened, you know, as you approached the door, and then there were a series of events once you passed through that threshold or over that threshold.
Quoting your father again, describing his minimalist sensibility as elegant conservative. And I've had the pleasure of owning and living into David Osler designs in my life.
Oh, have you?
I started life at Geddes Lakes, where many people started life.
Right, those are his.
You know, it was either Geddes Lakes or Pittsfield Village, right? When people first came to Ann Arbor back in those days. And loved my time there. Bought one of the older units that nothing, you know, had very little been done to. But it was the simplicity of living there. You know, the front door and that transition, the door was just a place a thing that kept the inside from the outside. It was a place to welcome your friends and your family into your home, and then you moved on from there. It wasn't a big, flashy, hey, here we are, double-story, columned, you know, detailed up the wazoo. It was just, come on in, you know. And then I bought a unit out at Newport West and lived out there for a number of years. And loved that, you know, and again, the huge amount of glass, the quality of light, the very simple walls, large wall surfaces, great for hanging things. Very simple, elegant living, very uncluttered, just lovely.
The first time I realized who David Osler was Oseland condos.
Right.
He also did those, and they were so different.
Yeah, and that's, the Oseland condos are interesting in that that's a project that gestated for many, many years. You know, that was on a property that he owned. That was part of the original farm holding as my grandparents.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he pretty much lived on the same street his entire life, which really, again, I think provided an attachment to the land that I think is quite unusual for most people, compared to most people. He really saw, I mean, he really loved that piece of land.
And Peter, as a point of reference for our listeners here, your mother and father, they were from Ohio originally? Or their families were from Ohio?
Well, my father's family was from Ohio.
Okay.
They were east central Ohio, and they moved up here for my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, to be the first agricultural extension agent in Washtenaw County.
Isn't that something?
And so he was an agronomist, and then my mother's, and they were both born in Ann Arbor, my parents. My mother was from an academic family at Michigan, and so it was a kind of a town and gown.
But your mother's
relationship.
family also had architects?
That was the family of architects, yeah. So my grandfather, my maternal grandfather was Emil Lorch, who was people consider him the founder of the architectural school in Michigan.
Lorch Hall.
Lorch Hall,
Yeah. And there were many others.
What a family, my goodness.
Yeah, well.
And was it that interest that brought the two of them together, your mother and father, or?
Well, you know, my father's early training was in commercial art. He was, you know, Damian spoke of his drawings. He could really draw quite beautifully, and from an early age he was drawing and you know, figurative portraits and landscapes and things. And it wasn't really until, I believe it was after the war, where he really started to, you know, he was facing the future of having children and raising a family, and he felt like maybe commercial art wasn't something that would be maybe provide the kind of, you know, financial stability that he felt he was obligated to. But I think also it was, I think architecture was something that he really gravitated to more because he really had a sense of needing to contribute. He talked about this a lot. This was one of his favorite words, was contributing, and in essence to the betterment of the world. And in I think his way of doing it was through architecture. And he really, I think commercial art was something that he saw as being a little bit thin or shallow, that it was just based in imagery, whereas architecture was, you know, changing the physical world. And I think that was something that he really felt strongly about. Again, having grown up in the Depression, he had a older brother who he really revered, who died early, and I think he really felt an obligation to his parents, to my mother, to us, to himself, for the most, you know, primarily, to really contribute to making things better.
He certainly did. I mean, you know, legacy is an extraordinary thing, right? The architecture, landscape architecture, which you're involved in now, it's a wonderful thing because we do get to see and we get to affect the environment and the surroundings and the way people live. But, you know, to spend a life of design as your dad did, and at this point that things have coincided so well that this legacy is being recognized in such a powerful way. And what we heard on one of our shows a couple of weeks ago is that Ann Arbor has probably one of the best collections in the country of mid-century modern. And so as this confluence of everything has come together here, we learned just last week that from the, I can't remember his name, Brian, who heads up the Michigan State Preservation, he's actually going to be doing a presentation out at the Mid-Century Modern Conference out in Palm Springs. And they're given a whole day just to focus on Ann Arbor. So the work of your father, of Metcalf, Muschenheim, some of these kinds of, these architects are going to be getting recognition that's long past due for the work that they did. Because if you look what they were doing at the time, that's really what's important, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, they were eschewing this layering and this ornamentation.
Yeah. It's, my father wasn't an academic. He wasn't involved in the university, but he was in that environment, and of course, because his father-in-law was running the school, that certainly it kept him involved with it to a certain degree. I think university towns with architecture schools are actually unusually strong in that regard. I was at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign last year, and who would think, it's out in the middle of no place, and who would think there might be some great design there? Well, they have a venerable, architecture program, and in fact, there's some fantastic mid-century modern buildings there that I didn't know of at all. Yeah. Somebody should do a book on, college town modern architecture or something, because I think that and a lot of that work is very hidden. It's done by faculty members who are, really outstanding in their own right, who find their way to some university, have great influence through the decades teaching students, but are doing work on the side, oftentimes in really small practices. So it's interesting. I'm not so. Ann Arbor is unique, but I think there are other places that would be surprisingly alike.
Did your father have a favorite building?
Of his own?
Of his own.
Well, there's a building that very few people would know about from relatively early in his career, and it's oh gosh.
Trying to remember.
Yeah, jeez.
While you're remembering, I wanted to mention to our listeners too that your father, David Osler, also was in the design competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
Yeah.
And he was one of the finalists for that.
Yeah, the way I understood it, I spoke to Hideo Sasaki, who was one of the jurors, and he said that he finished fourth, in the sense that I think they had a first, second, and third, and then they had 15 honorable mentions, of which my father was in, and Hideo said that his was the last one put into that 15 honorable mention group. And it really was a fantastic scheme, very, very site-oriented. Again, not an object, but in fact very much integrated with the larger context of the mall and the other monuments. He certainly felt as though he came close to really hitting it big in that competition. I think he sat down and did that competition in just a couple days. I think it was one of those projects that he kind of it stewed around in his mind for maybe a few weeks or something. Then he just sat down and it all came out.
Came out onto the paper.
Yeah.
Well, overall, his firm won 22 honor awards, and in 2005 won the Architectural Firm Award from the American Institute of Architects of Michigan. Just an incredible career, and left behind such a legacy, not only in the homes and the buildings that he created, but in his family. As we mentioned, you're an architect. Your sister Robin, she is an architect?
Yep.
And she works in
New York. She has her own office. She's the one who probably more than any other has kind of followed in my father's footsteps, kind of, fighting the battle of a small office and in a obviously very competitive market in New York City, and doing great work.
And your older sister Molly is an interior designer.
Yeah.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Yes. And so, as I said, it was hard to kind of think of doing anything else.
And your mom is still around as well, in her 90s?
Yes, she's 94 and actually doing quite well.
Oh, that's marvelous.
And I'm assuming living in the home that you grew up in?
Yeah.
On Glacier?
On Glacier Way. Yeah. And that property has changed through the years with the addition of Oseland and some other houses, and the house that my father grew up in has been redone by my father for another couple, and that property has changed and evolved in mostly good ways, I would say.
You pronounce it Oseland, so your last name is pronounced?
Well, yeah. If you look at the sign, actually, of Oseland, there's I don't know what you...
The two little...
Oh, for the O.
Well, the line that would...
Indicate it's a...
An O, yeah, an O, a hard O. So that really, it has a Scandinavian reference, Oslund, which, don't ask me what that word actually means, but there was so it was a bit of a double entendre there.
Oh, okay. And but you pronounce your family name?
Osler.
You do,
Osler.
Osler.
You know, I think that a lot of people would call it Osler. You know,
Okay.
Cerulean Osler.
Just wanted to make sure I hadn't been mispronouncing it for the
No,
entire
no.
interview.
The other thing I liked about David, he drove the one car that I think every architect really ought to drive,
Which is?
which is a Porsche 911 ST. He happened to drive for a long time a blue one, which was exactly the same model that my father drove in South Africa and I grew up with, and it is, I think, the consummate architect's iconic car.
Damian Farrell from Damian Farrell Design Group, each week with Damian on Design on 1290 WLBY. And what a pleasure talking with Peter Osler today and his memories of his father, David Osler, who passed away at the age of 93 in September of 2014, but certainly leaving that beautiful legacy.
Absolutely. We're fortunate, very fortunate. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
You're listening to Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY.